My name is Omar Al-Farsi. On July 14th, 2024, I was 17 years old, living in a cramped, second-floor apartment in Dearborn, Michigan. That afternoon, the humidity was a physical weight, the kind that makes the air feel recycled and heavy with the smell of asphalt and exhaust. My father was at the mosque, and my mother was in the kitchen, the rhythmic thwack of her knife against the cutting board the only sound in the house. I remember sitting at the small laminate desk in my room, staring at a pre-calculus textbook when the pressure started. It wasn't a sharp pain. It was a slow, agonizing expansion behind my breastbone, like someone was inflating a balloon inside my ribcage. I tried to stand up to call for my mother, but my legs felt like they belonged to someone else, distant and unresponsive. I gripped the edge of the desk, my knuckles turning a waxen white. I thought it was the heat, or maybe the 3 energy drinks I'd downed to pull an all-nighter. But then came the cold. It was a terrifying, subterranean chill that started in my fingertips and raced toward my heart. I slumped back into my chair, my vision narrowing until the room was just a pinprick of light. I heard the knife stop in the kitchen. "Omar," she called out. I tried to answer, but my tongue was a lead weight. The medical term I'd later learn was hypertrophic cardiomyopathy. A silent killer in young athletes, though I wasn't an athlete. I was just a kid who'd ignored a fluttering pulse for months. As I slid off the chair, my head hitting the carpet with a dull thud, I felt the finality of it. This wasn't a feint. This was the machinery of my body seizing up. I saw my mother's shadow appear in the doorway, her silhouette framed by the harsh afternoon sun. I heard her scream, a high, jagged sound that seemed to vibrate through the floorboards, but I couldn't feel the floor anymore. I was sliding into a deep, gray static. The last thing I felt was the vibration of her footsteps as she ran toward me. And then, the world simply went out. I wasn't in my room anymore, yet I was everywhere within it. I was hovering near the ceiling, looking down at a scene that felt clinical and detached. My body, the shell of Omar, was splayed on the beige carpet, looking smaller than I remembered. My mother was on her knees, her hands shaking as she pressed her phone to her ear, screaming our address to a dispatcher. I wanted to tell her to breathe, but I had no breath. Within 6 minutes, the room was flooded with men in navy blue uniforms. I watched with a strange, analytical clarity as the paramedics from the Dearborn Fire Department worked. V-fib, one of them barked. I saw the flash of the defibrillator pads, the way my chest jerked upward like a landed fish when the current hit. They were using a Lucas device, a mechanical chest compressor that made a rhythmic, metallic hiss-thump sound. I followed them as they lifted the gurney, moving through the narrow hallway, bumping against the framed verses of the Quran on the wall. The transition to the emergency room at Beaumont Hospital was a blur of fluorescent lights and the smell of antiseptic. I stood in the corner of Trauma Room 3. I watched Dr. Aris, a man with deep bags under his eyes, check my pupils. "No pupillary response," he muttered. I saw the clock on the wall, 4:22 p.m. I had been down for 28 minutes. In the medical world, that's the threshold of the end. I saw a nurse, a young woman named Sarah, bite her lip as she checked the monitor. The line was a flat, mocking green. I wasn't afraid. The fear had stayed with the body on the table. Up here, near the ceiling tiles, I just felt a profound sense of observation. I watched them stop. I watched Dr. Aris look at the nurse and give a slight, weary shake of his head. He reached for the sheet, but as he pulled it over my face, the room didn't get dark. The walls of the hospital simply dissolved, not into light, but into a vast, silent presence. The hospital was gone. The smell of bleach and the sound of the heart monitor were replaced by a silence so heavy it felt like a physical substance. I was standing in what looked like a vast, suburban street at dusk, the blue hour, where everything feels suspended. But it wasn't my neighborhood. The houses were familiar, typical American split levels and ranch homes, but they looked brittle, like they were made of dry parchment. There was a man standing a few yards away from me. He wasn't glowing, and there were no wings. He wore a simple, dark tunic, and his skin was the color of the earth in the Jordan Valley. I knew him, not because I'd seen a picture, but because my soul recognized its architect. I grew up hearing about Isa, the prophet, but the person standing before me was more than a messenger. He was the point of origin. I felt a wave of shame hit me, my upbringing, my doubts, my secret life as a teenager in America. I started to sink to my knees, the weight of my own skin feeling like a mountain of lead. But he moved before I could drop. He didn't touch me with his hands. He touched my mind with a thought that felt like a warm hand on a cold shoulder. "Do not hide, Omar," he said. His voice wasn't loud, but it had the resonance of a cello. It was a physical vibration that settled the static in my head. He didn't look at me with judgment. He looked at me with a devastating kind of empathy, the kind that sees every mistake and loves you anyway. He began to walk down the middle of this gray, suburban street, and I found myself following him. As we walked, I noticed the houses were changing. The windows were flickering with images like silent televisions. They weren't scenes from the past, they were scenes of right now. I saw people in kitchens, people on their phones, people lying in bed staring at ceilings. There was a palpable tension in the air, a sense of a coiled spring about to snap. He stopped in front of a house that looked exactly like mine, but the door was hanging off its hinges. "You asked why you are here," he said, turning to me. "You are here because the land you call home has forgotten how to breathe." The man I knew as Jesus didn't look at the house. He looked through it. As we stood on that gray, silent street, the walls of the split-level home became translucent, like thin gauze. Inside, I saw a family. A father sitting at a kitchen table with a stack of past-due notices, his head in his hands. His teenage daughter was in the next room, her face illuminated by the cold, blue light of a smartphone, her thumb scrolling with a frantic, rhythmic desperation. There was no conversation. The air between them was filled with a static, a jagged red energy that looked like heat waves rising off a desert road. "This is the heart of the American house, Omar," he said. His voice didn't carry pity. It carried the weight of a factual observation. They are connected by wires but severed by spirit. They live in a land of plenty, yet they are starving for a bread that does not come from a shelf. He gestured toward the horizon, and the suburban street began to stretch and warp. I saw the skylines of Chicago, Detroit, and New York bleeding into one another. Over each city, there was a heavy, charcoal-colored mist. It wasn't smoke or smog. It was a collective weight of anxiety and unspoken anger. I felt a sudden, sharp pang in my own chest, not the physical heart attack from the apartment, but a spiritual grief. I saw the grocery stores where people avoided eye contact, the courtrooms where the air was thick with a desire for vengeance rather than justice, and the churches where the lights were bright but the corners were cold. "The shift is not coming, Omar," he told me, his eyes locking onto mine with a clarity that made me want to look away. "The shift is already here. The foundation has turned to sand, and the wind is beginning to rise. People look to the high places for answers, to the screens and the stages, but the rot is in the floorboards of the home." I watched as a crack formed in the driveway of the house before us, a jagged black line that mirrored the division I felt in my own family between my father's tradition and my own American drift. The scene shifted abruptly. We weren't on the street anymore. We were standing in the hallway of my high school. The lockers were dented, and the floor smelled of floor wax and old milk. This was my world. I saw my best friend, Khalil, standing by his locker. He looked tired, older than 18. He was staring at a text message from his brother, who had been struggling with addiction for 2 years. I saw the way Khalil's shoulders slumped, the way he tucked the phone into his pocket and put on a mask of indifference as a teacher walked by. "You see his silence?" Jesus asked. He was standing right next to Khalil, though Khalil couldn't see him. "This is the American silence. It is the sound of a generation that has inherited a house they cannot afford to heat. They have been told they can be anything, yet they feel they are nothing." As he spoke, I felt a sickening jolt in my gut. My bank app notification popped up in my mind, a vivid, intrusive memory of my balance, minus $42.00. I remembered the lie I told my parents about where the money went. I remembered the feeling of being a fraud in my own skin, caught between the expectations of my mosque and the reality of my debt. Suddenly, the school hallway began to vibrate. The lockers rattled against the walls. I saw the students stop in their tracks, their faces pale. It wasn't an earthquake, it was a social tremor. I saw a news feed projected onto the air, flashpoints of protest, the closing of a local factory, the digital access denied screen on a vital government website. "The systems you trust are brittle," he said, his hand resting on the cold metal of a locker. "When the bank doors close and the screens go dark, what is left? Only the person standing next to you. And in this land, you have forgotten how to see the person standing next to you." The weight of my own secrets felt like physical stones in my pockets. I realized then that I wasn't just a spectator. I was part of the collapse. The environment darkened until we were standing in a small, cramped office, my father's tax business. I saw my father sitting at his desk, the fluorescent light flickering overhead. He looked ancient. He was staring at a letter from the building's landlord, an eviction notice. This was a detail I hadn't known. He'd been hiding it from us, working extra hours at the warehouse just to keep the lights on in the apartment. The shame I felt was suffocating. I had been worried about energy drinks and pre-calc while my father was drowning in silence. "This is the fracture, Omar," Jesus said. He walked over to the desk and placed a hand on my father's bowed head. My father didn't look up, but he let out a long, shuddering breath. The fathers hide the truth to protect the sons, and the sons hide the truth to protect themselves. The result is a house of glass. He turned to me, and for the first time, his expression was stern. "You ask about America. America is not a map. It is a covenant of neighbors, and that covenant is breaking because you have traded the truth for the image of the truth." He reached out and touched a mirror on the wall. It didn't shatter into pieces. It dissolved into a liquid black pool. In the reflection, I didn't see myself. I saw a version of me that was hollow, a shell that moved through the motions of prayer and school but felt nothing. I saw the moment I'd stolen $20 from my mother's purse to pay for a subscription I didn't need. I saw the way I'd looked at my neighbors with suspicion because they had different flags on their porches. "The warning is this," he said, his voice dropping to a low, resonant frequency that made my teeth ache. "If the heart of the individual does not turn, the heart of the nation cannot beat. You are looking for a political savior, but you are dying of a spiritual thirst." The office began to dissolve into a swirl of gray wind, and I felt the first real sense of terror since I'd died. The personal cost of my own apathy was being laid bare. The wind died down, and we were standing in an empty, echoing warehouse, the kind that dots the outskirts of Detroit, smelling of cold grease and damp concrete. Jesus stood in the center of the vast floor, the light from a high, cracked window falling across his face. He looked at me, and the space between us seemed to vanish. "You want to know what the title of your life's warning means, Omar?" he said, his voice cutting through the hollow silence. "You ask why America is spoken of in the halls of the end. It is because this land was given a unique weight, and that weight is now tearing the floor." He didn't use metaphors. He spoke with a terrifying, clinical precision. The outcome of the coming years is not written in stone, but it is written in the hearts of those who think they are safe. The reason this happens, the reason the friction is rising, is because the people have traded the eternal for the immediate. They have built a kingdom of glass and are surprised when it shatters under the heat of the truth. I felt the floor beneath me vibrate. "What changes is the illusion of stability," he continued. "The systems of credit, the systems of comfort, and the systems of quiet compliance will fail. This will affect everyone, from the man in the high tower to the mother in the kitchen, because they have all drank from the same well of indifference." I asked him, my voice trembling, "What determines the outcome?" He stepped closer, his presence overwhelming. "The outcome is determined by the return to the neighbor. If you cannot love the person you can see, you cannot survive the days where you cannot see the way forward. The warning is not of a fire from the sky, but of a freezing of the human heart. When the heart freezes, the hands turn to violence. That is the warning. That is why the land groans." I saw a flicker of the future, a digital blackout, a silent grocery store, and the look of pure, unadulterated panic on a stranger's face. The warehouse began to dissolve into a series of rapid-fire images that felt like a sensory overload. I saw my father's tax office again, but this time, the eviction notice was being taped to the door. I saw my mother crying over a grocery receipt that she couldn't pay. These weren't possibilities. They felt like impending arrivals. "You have a choice, Omar," Jesus said. We were now standing in the middle of a crowded intersection in downtown Detroit. People were rushing past us, their faces blurred, their movements jerky like a corrupted video file. You can return to the body and live as a ghost, fearing the collapse, hoarding your scraps, and hiding your light. Or you can return as a witness. He pointed to a man sitting on a park bench, looking at a broken watch. To be a witness is to carry the peace that does not make sense when the world stops making sense. It is to tell the truth when the lie is cheaper. I felt a sudden, visceral pull toward the earth, a heaviness in my limbs that signaled my time in this gray space was ending. The blue hour was fading into a deep, obsidian black. I looked at my hands. They were beginning to turn back into solid flesh, the pale skin of a teenager who had spent too much time indoors. "The personal fracture you feel," he said, his voice now sounding like it was coming from inside my own skull, "is the bridge to your purpose. Your debt, your father's failure, your mother's fear, these are not weights to sink you. They are the ground where you must stand." I realized then that I didn't want to go back. The peace in his presence was more addictive than any comfort I'd known on earth. But the choice wasn't about my comfort. It was about a debt I owed to the living. "Go," he said, and the word felt like a physical shove. "And remember, the darkness is only the absence of a person willing to be the light." The transition wasn't a peaceful drift. It was a violent, crushing descent. It felt like being dropped from a great height into a pool of ice water. One moment, I was in the presence of the architect of the world, and the next, I was slammed back into the narrow, suffocating confines of my own chest. The first thing I felt was the pain, a jagged, burning sensation in my sternum from the chest compressions. My ribs felt like they had been pulverized. Then came the smell, the metallic tang of blood, the sharp ozone of the defibrillator, and the cloying scent of hospital-grade disinfectant. I gasped, a raw, wet sound that tore through my throat. My eyes flew open, but all I saw was the harsh, blinding glare of the surgical lights. "He's back. We have a rhythm," a voice shouted. It sounded like it was underwater. I felt hands on me, cold, frantic, professional hands. Someone was shoving a tube down my throat, and I gagged, my body bucking against the restraints I didn't know were there. The clinical reality was a nightmare compared to the gray street. I wanted to scream about the warehouse, about the houses of glass, about the man with the earth-colored skin, but I was trapped in a broken machine. I looked up and saw Dr. Harris. He looked like he'd seen a ghost, which, I suppose, he had. He was staring at the monitor, his mouth slightly open. The flat green line was now a frantic, jagged mountain range of peaks and valleys. I tried to reach out, to grab his arm, to tell him that the hospital walls were thin, but my arms wouldn't move. I was pinned to the table by the weight of my own survival. As they wheeled me toward the ICU, the shadows of the hallway flickering over my face, I heard a nurse whisper, 32 minutes. He was gone for 32 minutes. I closed my eyes. The image of my father's eviction notice burned into the back of my eyelids. The ICU was a symphony of rhythmic suffering. The whoosh hiss of the ventilator in my throat felt like a parasite, breathing for me because my own lungs had forgotten the rhythm. Every time I closed my eyes, I wasn't seeing the back of my eyelids. I was seeing the translucent walls of that American split level. I was seeing the charcoal mist over Detroit. The nurses moved around me like shadows, efficient, tired, and profoundly disconnected. I watched them through a haze of fentanyl and physical trauma, noticing the way they avoided looking at my eyes, focusing instead on the bags of saline and the digital readouts of my failing pressure. 3 days after I died, they pulled the tube out. My father was there, his face a map of fresh wrinkles and a gray, ashy pallor I hadn't noticed a week ago. He took my hand, his skin like dry parchment. "Omar," he whispered, his voice cracking. "The doctors, they say it is a miracle. You are a miracle." I wanted to tell him that the miracle was a heavy thing. I wanted to tell him about the warehouse and the man in the dark tunic who knew about the eviction notice. But my throat was a raw wound, and the words felt too large for the room. I just squeezed his hand, feeling the tremors in his fingers. That evening, a social worker named Marcus came by. He had a clipboard and a practiced, sympathetic smile that didn't reach his eyes. He talked about aftercare and billing adjustments, but his mind was clearly on the stack of files in his lap. As he spoke, I saw it. The red energy Jesus had shown me. It was pulsing around Marcus's head, a jagged flicker of anxiety. He wasn't thinking about my heart. He was thinking about the fact that his car insurance was 3 weeks overdue and his daughter's tuition was rising. The land of plenty was starving right in front of me. I realized then that the return wasn't a gift, it was an assignment. I was seeing the fractures in the people who were supposed to be whole. A week later, I was discharged. The walk to our apartment was a gauntlet of sensory triggers. The air in Dearborn smelled of charcoal and rain, but to me, it felt thin, as if the atmosphere itself was losing its density. We climbed the stairs to our second-floor unit in silence. My mother had prepared makluba, the smell of fried eggplant and spiced rice filling the small space, but the air was stagnant. My father sat at the small laminate table, the same one where I had collapsed, and he didn't eat. He just stared at a small, white envelope sitting near the salt shaker. "Baba," I said, my voice still a raspy shadow of what it used to be. He didn't look up. He pushed the envelope toward me. I opened it, my hands shaking. It wasn't the eviction notice, not yet. It was a letter from the bank regarding his business loan. The interest rate had spiked, a market adjustment that added $800 to his monthly payment. It was the exact numerical representation of the brittle system I had been warned about. The access denied screen I had seen in the vision wasn't a computer error. It was a door closing on a man who had done everything right. I went to my room and sat at my desk. I looked at my phone. Khalil had sent a text. "Bro, I can't do this. My brother's back in rehab, and my mom lost her hours at the plant. Everything is falling apart." I stared at the screen, the blue light reflecting in my eyes. This was the social tremor. This was the freezing of the heart. I looked at the wall where the framed verses of the Quran hung. For the first time, they didn't feel like decorations. They felt like a challenge. I remembered the man's words. The outcome is determined by the return to the neighbor. I realized I couldn't just be a son anymore. I had to be the person who saw the access denied sign and stood in the gap. The final proof didn't come in a dream. It came on a Tuesday afternoon, 2 weeks after my heart stopped. I was walking back from the pharmacy, my chest still aching with every deep breath. I passed the local branch of our bank, the one where my father had kept his business account for 20 years. There was a small, handwritten sign taped to the glass door. "System offline. No cash withdrawals at this time." A small crowd had gathered, their faces pale, their voices rising in a sharp, panicked discordance. I saw a woman I recognized from our mosque, Mrs. Haddad. She was tapping her debit card against the glass, her eyes wide with a frantic, animal terror. "I need my money for the medicine," she was saying to no one. "They told me it was safe." I looked at her, and for a second, the street disappeared. I saw the gray suburb again. I saw the man in the tunic standing right behind her, his hand on her shoulder, though she couldn't feel him. He looked at me, his eyes a silent command. I reached into my pocket and pulled out the $20 I had left from my birthday money. The money I was going to use to replace the energy drinks and the snacks I'd lost. I walked up to Mrs. Haddad and pressed the bill into her hand. She stopped tapping the glass. She looked at the money, then at me, her expression shifting from panic to a bewildered, fragile silence. It wasn't enough to save her, and it wouldn't save my father's business. But in that moment, the red static around her head dimmed. The air between us cleared. As I walked away, I looked back at the bank door. The offline sign was still there, a permanent mark of the shift that had begun. My father's business would close a month later, and we would move into a smaller place, but the weight in my chest was gone. The world was breaking, just as he said, but I wasn't a ghost anymore. I sat on the curb, watching the panicked crowd, and felt the sun on my face.